Hi, you are in the ladies' room with Dr. Tamika, the only public ladies' room you can enter anytime without ever waiting online. I'm your host, Dr. Tamika Moore. We'll be having real conversations with real women about really intimate issues. They may be embarrassing, sad, or funny, but they will always be interesting and informative. You know, like the best conversations you've had in ladies' rooms with your best friends, or total strangers and a physician. Please join us. Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Tamika. Now, I met our next guest, Tamika Felder, in 2007 when we were both being honored with the Women in Government Presidential Leadership Award in recognition of efforts to raise awareness about and educate about cervical cancer, of course, including its prevention, early diagnosis, in order to try to achieve the goal to eliminate cervical cancer in our lifetimes. And I have not given up on that goal. But there are two big differences between me and Tamika in getting that award. All I had to do to earn it was to talk about cervical cancer. Tamika actually lived through it and created an empowering advocacy organization called Tamika Friends, which has continued to do great work ever since. And I am still talking. So, of course, when I started this podcast, Tamika was high on my list of women who I wanted to invite into the ladies' room to share her story. Now, I'm going to let her tell it, of course, but spoiler alert for those of you who are in a hurry. She was diagnosed with cervical cancer at age 25, and like 257,524 women in the United States, I'm going to repeat that again because I kind of bumbled it, over 250,000 women in the United States, she is living beyond cervical cancer. But I will let her fill you in on all the rest of the details. But just to give you a little more background about her amazing career path and how she came to be where she is today, she's the founder, and I love her title. She calls herself the Chief Visionary of Tamika and Friends, which is a national not-for-profit organization dedicated to cervical cancer awareness through a network of survivors, and they spell that CERVIVORS, not SUR, and their friends. Her inspiring story and message have been featured everywhere in numerous media outlets. I'm not even going to give you the list. She is an internationally renowned speaker whose favorite topics include young adults and cancer, dating during and after cancer, and the ever so popular sex and cancer. So now you know why she really got invited to come talk to us in the ladies' room. She's passionate about helping cervical cancer survivors live their best life after cancer. Her current project, Survivor, is a game changer in the world of cervical cancer advocacy. I'm going to let her tell you about that, but she currently resides in the Washington, D.C. area and has also been an award-winning television producer and TV host. So before I let you hear directly from her, I just want you to hear indirectly from the American Cancer Society with some facts about cervical cancer. Now, I already told you the good news, which there are 257,000 women in the United States living beyond cervical cancer diagnosis. Every year, though, about 13,000 new cases of invasive cervical cancer will be diagnosed. And every year, over 4,000 women will die from cervical cancer. And just to give you a really sad note of comparison, that's more than all the people who died on 9/11 every single year. Now, of course, cervical precancers are diagnosed far more often than invasive cervical cancer, which is the good news. Cervical cancer used to be one of the most common causes of cancer death in American women, and it still is one of the leading causes of cancer death in the world. But in the United States, it dropped significantly with the increased use of the Pap test, and I hope everybody's getting their Pap smear every year. We now have additional diagnostic and screening technology with the HPV test and the HPV vaccine. Now, cervical cancer tends to occur in midlife and is most frequently diagnosed in women between the ages of 35 and 44. It rarely develops in women younger than 20, and we now know that this is probably because the overwhelming majority, almost 100%, not quite 100%, of cervical cancers are caused by HPV, the human papilloma virus, which is a sexually transmitted infection. Most older women, however, don't realize that the risk of developing cervical cancer is still present as they age. And more than 15% of cervical cancer cases are found in women over 65. Now, I like to talk about racial differences and racial disparities in healthcare issues. In the United States, Hispanic women are most likely to get cervical cancer, followed by African American women, Asian women, and then Pacific Islanders, and finally white women. American Indians and Alaskan Natives, however, have the lowest risk of cervical cancer in this country. So with all of that background, welcome Tamika Felder into the ladies' room. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's good to always see you.
Mm-hmm.
I love everything you're doing, and I love talking in the ladies' room. So,
Thank you.
It's just great. I'm excited. I'm a 17-year cervical cancer survivor, and I will say that to a tree stump, whoever, because I am all about living this life and being excited about it, because I talk to those women who are impacted by cervical cancer. I've gotten to know women who die from this disease. When you call out those numbers, that's one too many: mother, sister, daughter, girlfriend, friend, best friend, aunt, grandmother. It's one too many, especially because unlike many other cancers, we now have the tools to eradicate, not just get those numbers lowered. We're seeing with the vaccine that in Australia, they've specifically wiped out not only precancers, but cervical cancers. And so we've got to catch up here in the US. And it's, I talk about sexuality because you can't talk about your coochie or your cervix or going to the stirrups if you don't talk about sex. And in this country, it's still a taboo issue, and we still have—
How'd that happen?
I don't know. But, I'm assuming, I'm born and raised in South Carolina from, that good Bible Belt family. I'm a church girl. I grew up in the church, mother religious, father, and, the whole family. We went to church all day, every day, multiple times a week. And I never got that talk, when it was time. I remember before I went off to college, my brother this is what he said to me, because I have siblings who are way older than I am. And he said, I don't know if you're a virgin. If you are, good. If you aren't, I don't want to know. And that literally was
that was your sex talk
that I got. And I remember thinking that there has to be more of this. And then you end up educating yourself and all this other stuff, and that's a whole nother, topic we could discuss for days and days. But once I was diagnosed with cervical cancer and I realized the connection between sex, the stigma because of the human papillomavirus, I wanted nothing to do with it. I was like, why couldn't I get ovarian cancer or something else?
Thank God you didn't get ovarian cancer.
No, exactly.
Ovarian cancer is way worse.
At 25 in 2001, that's what I was thinking. I was like, it would be easier because
you wanted something more socially acceptable.
Exactly. And you know better. Oprah and Maya Angelou, they say, you know better, you do better. And as I educated myself, and remember in 2001, there was no Google, there was no Facebook. We couldn't go Facebook Live and
there was no HPV vaccine. Exactly. We didn't know about the connection between HPV.
Test wasn't even FDA
right
yet.
Right.
And there wasn't a lot of information. And I was like, I don't want to be connected to this. I don't want to tell people because I feel ashamed. When I feel ashamed of things, as most people, I think it eats you away inside. And so I started talking to my girlfriends, that ladies' room kind of chatter.
Yeah.
And they all were like, how did this happen to you again? Because 25, radical hysterectomy, chemotherapy. I lost my womb. Mother's Day is coming. And it's a double-edged sword for me because I don't have my own children. I lost my mother. And it's really hard because I wanted to be a mom. I was one of those women that I was focused on my career. And I felt like I punished myself because I wasn't rushing into a relationship to get married and start a family. But that's not my story. My story is that I was blessed and lucky enough to survive cervical cancer. I think a couple things happen when you go through something as traumatic as that, is that you find the will to live and go forward, or you just you're stagnant, you're stuck. And so for me, I remember thinking that I couldn't go forward, that, life as I knew it was completely different. And at some point there was this thing like, hey, you were blessed to still have your life, and you have to survive. And so out of that, I started talking to my friends and then church groups and other civic organizations and invited to tell my story. And, over a decade now, I've become this, as people say, global patient advocate. And I think it's because I will not stop talking about this, because every time someone dies from cervical cancer, I know that it could have been me. It could have easily been me. I know that healthcare access isn't equal across the board. That's why we have healthcare disparities. I want those, communities of color that are diagnosed at greater levels, that die at higher rates, to know that they are at risk for these things. I want people to go and put their feet up in the stirrups. I had a scare a little over a month ago, and I thought my cancer was back, and I ended up having to get a minimally invasive surgery, but it all started with my feet up in the stirrups. And if I didn't go, who knows what could have happened. Right. And, I had clear margins, but it brought me back to that place where I was so scared. And you go sometimes and you think, oh my God, my feet are ashy. I need to save my leg. Do I need to wax my vag?
No, you do not.
And you don't. You don't.
Do not. And there is nothing that you will come up with that your gynecologist has not seen already 3 times that day. But I also want to talk about this thing that you talked about, getting your feet up in the stirrups at least every year. I have a friend who I'm just fed up with, and I've told her to her face, so I'm not saying anything behind her back. Every time I see her, I nag her about, she has not been to the gynecologist in over 10 years. And she says, if I have something, I just don't want to know. And the really sad thing is that of the 4,100 women who die of cervical cancer per year, we know that more than half of them had not even had a pap test in over 5 years. Oh, that was you. I did not know that about your story.
I was at 3 years.
Okay, well, 3.
I always share that.
Okay.
I always share that. And had I waited those extra 2 years or whatever, I wouldn't be here talking with you.
Well, one of the guidelines for pap smears in women in their 20s is that if you've had 3 consecutive normal pap smears, you can wait 3 years, so long as you're in a mutually monogamous relationship. And I hate that guideline, and I always argue about it, because who's always the last one to know she's no longer in a mutually monogamous relationship? A. Right. And B, you could have contracted HPV long before 3 years before, and it could still be dormant in your body, and it could cause those changes. So I want all women to have a pap smear every year, and it is cheap, and it is easy, and it is, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, it is covered by whatever kind of insurance you have. If you don't have insurance, there are plenty of public health clinics where you can go to get your pap smear. And then the other thing I want to say is that, and I haven't talked about this publicly ever before, it just occurred to me having this conversation. I think I did tell you this when we first met, but in my family, we buried a family member at 52 who died of cervical cancer. And she had not had a pap smear in, I think, 10 years. So when she was diagnosed, she was, in stage 4, the most advanced stages of cervical cancer. And I just remember standing over her grave, just feeling so horrible that here I was, a doctor and somebody who spoke out about cervical cancer as much as anybody would listen to me. And I couldn't get this woman in my own family to go have a pap smear.
Women don't want to do it. And it's what I call my 11th commandment. It's just something that you have to do no matter what. You've got to do it. And I encourage women to go every single year. They have to go in for a well woman exam and, talk to your healthcare provider. That's where you can decide what tests you need, how often you need the test. But regardless of those guidelines, because there's just that.
The guidelines. I remember when the HPV test first came out, I was in the age group that was recommended. We don't recommend it till 30. And I don't remember how old I was, but I was definitely well over 30. And I went in and I told my gynecologist, who's also a personal friend, that I wanted the HPV test along with everything else. And she said, well, you don't have any risk factors. You've been married 100 years. You don't have any risk factors for HPV. I said, well, first of all, you didn't ask me any questions to determine if I have any risk factors. And second of all women over 30 should have this test, regardless, because of a aforementioned comment about who's the last one to know. And also, you could have contracted something long before you were married, even if you only have sex with one person one time.
Yeah, I mean, there are all these notions out here of who gets HPV, who gets cervical cancer. I mean, now there's all these talks about oral cancers, white men over the age of 60, being the largest group number that gets oral cancers.
Well, Michael Douglas was outspoken about that. And props to him for talking about how he had throat cancer, which was from HPV.
Killed oral cancer. And I'm like, no, I mean, oral sex. And I'm like, no.
Well, that was the implication. I think I saw him do the interview. It was, the reporter asked him how he got this. And I think what he said exactly was, how do you think I got it?
Yeah.
And good for him making jokes about, he dealing with a very, very sensitive topic. So, the fact is anybody can get it. The good news is when the HPV vaccine came out, that was an excuse for all of us to talk about this much more. What got me very angry at the time was this whole issue about this was going to make teenage girls more promiscuous if they had the HPV vaccine. And I was like, first of all, that's a manufactured controversy. That is not a medical issue. I said, it is not vaccines that make teenage girls horny. It's teenage boys that make teenage girls horny. Number two, I said, how many of you discussed diphtheria with your infants before you gave them the diphtheria vaccine? How many doctors have even seen diphtheria in their careers? But we vaccinate to prevent these illnesses. I said, if you don't want to tell your daughter what causes cervical cancer, that's your choice. But give her the vaccine and don't tell her what it's for.
I have family and friends who know my story, but they, see those clickbait articles on social media and, they automatically think, well, I don't need that for my child. And I'm like, I hope you're so lucky. And
I hope your child is not dating my child in the future.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that it's hard. It's one of the reasons why I started my organization too. One was because I felt so alone and so isolated. There were support groups for other people. And as a young woman going through it, I was also seeking someone who wasn't married, didn't have kids that I could connect to on that level, just out of college, really starting their career path. And, I felt lonely. And so I started Tamika Friends, which in 2013, we changed to Survivor. And it's really when I understood the power of stories. So as a television producer, I understood the power of stories. As a patient advocate, because that wasn't, something that was on my radar at the time, I truly didn't understand it. But when I started putting it together, I was like, when it comes to cervical cancer and the stigma, the reason why the stigma exists is because there are not more women speaking out about this cancer. So I really sought out to find women who would want to share their story. And then, of course, everyone was nervous because, they didn't want to be branded with the letters HPV across them. And so I started this thing called Survivor School. So I thought, my media background, how to tell a story, and I'm really passionate about advocacy. Let me bring these women together and give them the tools, have experts for them to talk to, and really understand how HPV is connected to cervical cancer. I mean, and in the short time, this week alone, we have someone who is in Cartagena, Colombia, sharing their story today. Another person who's in Chicago, someone in Georgia. And I literally am so proud of these women because it's not comfortable talking about cervical cancer at times. If you have another cancer and you come out as a survivor, you are automatically cheered on and people are rooting for you. And not that it doesn't happen in our community, but it also comes with people are like, well, how did they get that? What happened?
So let me just clear something up about HPV. So I said earlier, you can get HPV from having sex with one person one time. 80% of women in their 20s have had HPV. There are about 100 strains of HPV. Only about 16 of them are what we call the oncogenic strains, or the bad strains, or the ones that cause cervical cancer. Those are the ones that are most likely to cause cervical cancer. And in fact, of those, only 4 are like the really big ones. So about 80% of women in their 20s have some form of HPV, and most of them are able to clear it by the time they turn 30, which is why we don't recommend the HPV test till women are at 30. Because we figure, okay, let's get rid of all, let's not bother testing all the women who are going to be positive anyway, and then clear it from their own immune system. It is possible to have a positive HPV test and then not yet have any signs of pre-cancer or precancerous signs. But that's what's so awesome about having the HPV test and the pap smear together. Yeah, because they give us different information. A lot of women, I think they're the same thing.
Yeah, and it's confusing. It's not as easy as saying, oh, at this age, go get screened for cervical cancer. There are all these like subcategories.
Right.
And that's why, women have to have a conversation with their doctor. They have to ask questions.
And teenagers have to have a conversation with their moms.
Exactly.
Because usually their moms are the gatekeeper to getting to a doctor, except, thank you God for Planned Parenthood. Because you don't need your mom's permission to go to Planned Parenthood when you're a teenager. And in fact, we know that about 1 in 5 women has visited a Planned Parenthood clinic at some point in their lives for exactly this kind of medical care. So, let's give them a shout out, because I think they're awesome.
Absolutely.
But I think for all the moms who are listening, I think we have an obligation to be more proactive with our own children. And I did this with my daughter. When she was 15, I said, I just want you to come meet my gynecologist. You're going to have, an appointment. You're going to keep all your clothes on. You're not going to get an exam, but I want you to meet her. And what I said is, I want you to know you can go see her at any time without my permission. And I even had them swipe my credit card, at the office. And I said, I don't need to know anything. And I think that's a really important conversation for mothers and daughters to have.
It's so important. I did something similar with my 15-year-old stepdaughter when she was 14. One, I got her vaccinated for HPV, but I also wanted to let her know, because I feel like, as young women, I don't know about you, but I wasn't prepared for my first pap smear or even a pelvic exam or anything like that. They're great books for when you're about to get your period or you just got them. But, just in talking to the moms that I talk to and other people, they're really, young girls are scared. They're like, wait, I'm going to do what?
Wait, what?
And so I absolutely love what you did. Go to the doctor, do a meet and greet, see the chairs, see the stirrup.
Actually, that's a great idea for a future podcast topic. Is your first, somebody is calling me. I forgot the first number one rule of podcasting is turn off your phone. Although I had this great idea that I thought it'd be fun to leave the phone on, and then whoever calls in, it's like, hello, you're live in the ladies' room.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm going to remember that. We're going to do a future episode on your first GYN exam. And what we're going to do is how to talk to your daughters about it, but also we're going to have women reflect and remember on their first GYN exam. I think I blocked mine out.
I think I blocked mine out too. But again, I think that's why it's a necessary thing, because I think that kind of breaks down that fear. It also breaks down women not wanting to go unless they need birth control or something like that, so that they know this is something that is normal, that, women have been doing, for
a long time.
Very long time. God bless Mary Papa Nicolau, for being the test subject.
Absolutely. And George Papanicolaou was the inventor of the pap smear, and that's who you're talking about. But anyway, so tell me some stories, since you're, a great storyteller. That's your background. Tell us some of the stories that you have heard from women about their diagnosis and about their journey. And what sticks out for you as, some of the more powerful things that you've heard?
I think that we talk a lot in our community about people perceiving cervical cancer as an easy cancer. We know firsthand that it is not an easy cancer. Um, Cervical cancer, if you survive it, it comes with a lot of dysfunctions, including sexual dysfunction. From any cancer, there's trauma. I'm so glad that people are now talking about cancer trauma. Cervical cancer and testicular cancer has two of the highest incidents of divorce, and it's because it comes with that sexual dysfunction, the lack of intimacy, trying to find that new normal with your body after cancer. For someone like me, not only do I have scars from my surgery, but I also have pretty bad radiation burns. I've learned to pivot with my new normal, and thankfully I have a very understanding husband. I don't think there's enough support for co-survivors, for partners and spouses and whatnot. I think that when it comes to cervical cancer, people think that when they see 4,000 women die of it, they think that it's such a low number. When they think of 13,000 being diagnosed, it's a low number.
Well, that's why I like to put the 4,000 number in contrast to the number of people who died on 9/11. Because we are always saying these numbers of people who die from or contract or get various diseases, and people have no concept anymore of what 4,000 means.
Right.
Are you kidding me? 4,000 women die a year of cervical cancer, and that's considered a small number. So whereas we think of 9/11 as this humongous tragedy, which it was, and yet more women die every year from cervical cancer than from what happened on that day that most of us will remember forever.
I have not encountered one woman in all my years of doing this, whether it is stage 0, stage 1, or stage 4, that is not living with some side effect that impacts their daily life, including just women who have to wear compression garments every single day, including in the summer, because of their lymphatic system when they have lymph nodes removed. There are chemo brain that affects the chemo brain with cervical cancer, because we're radiated, whether it's internal and external radiation, right in our vaginal area, so it affects the colon. So we talk about a lot of poop. Talk about the ladies' room. We talk
about all the toilet talk topics here.
Yes, a lot of poop in our community, because we have a greater risk of bowel obstructions. Not sexy, not fun, but it's something that our community deals with. Oh my goodness, a lot.
We talk about that a lot in the ladies' room. We talk about a lot of bowel problems. We've had gastroenterologists on. Because most women don't know where to turn to get the answers to those questions. But we also talk a lot about sex. So let's talk about the sexual dysfunction issues. And then we'll get to the dating issues.
So with the sexual dysfunction, I think, for me, I had the top third of my vagina removed. And most people are like, wait, what?
Right, because most people think of the vagina as just a hole. They don't think of it as an actual organ.
Right. And so that has its own special circumstances. Then you add radiation on top of it and talk about dryness and shrinkage, and then
because did you have your ovaries removed as well?
I still have my ovaries because I was 25 at the time. So the hormone issue, even with keeping them, they're all over the place, because your body is like, what did you just do to me? And so it's been dealing with that part of it. dilators. They're people that are,
and these are vaginal dilators. Most women have not heard of vaginal dilators.
I never was until I had cervical cancer. And then you realize,
and these are medical instruments. These are not sex toys.
And so I always tell people, go get sex toys, but to be mindful of, using the dilators in the same size, finding, a sex toy that maybe mimics the size. Because the medical dilators look like candlesticks.
Yeah.
They're not fun, but they're necessary. But we have women who are on the smallest dilator that maybe just literally the size of this straw, okay? And they cannot fit it into their vagina. We have women who've had cervical cancer that no longer can have an exam with a speculum. Mm-hmm. Because of shrinkage or their vagina, what's left of it, fusing together. And I'm always looking to specialists whenever I go to conferences. I'm like, there's nothing we can do about that. And it's sad to me in most cases that there isn't. And that's not an easy cancer. Those things make it easy.
Well, yeah, the term easy cancer is an oxymoron.
Exactly.
Even the most benign form of skin cancer comes with, the stress of the disfigurement when you're healing from the surgery, and also then the constant worry that it might be coming back. So that's always a concern.
One of the things that I talk about, which, I've rubbed some people wrong with it, but most people love it. I'm like, I survived cervical cancer, so I at least deserve a good orgasm.
I was going to ask you about that because I saw that somewhere online that you had said that. So did you say that to your doctor or did you say that to your husband?
Oh, I said it to everybody.
Actually, that's a great line that most women can adapt in some way. I survived childbirth, so I deserve a good orgasm. Or I survived dealing with you for 10 years, so I deserve.
And it's a little tongue in cheek, but it's definitely a conversation starter.
Yep.
Because for me, when, I first realized, oh, my vagina it's broken, it's not working. I thought, okay, I survived cancer. I should be grateful that I survived cancer. How dare me to also want to have great sex on top of it. And it's like, okay, so it's not going to be great sex, but that's not a quality of life. And I believe in a good quality.
Well, there's lots of other ways to have great sex.
Exactly. But we had to start talking about those things. So if you're not talking about it, so if I'm newly, diagnosed or as a new survivor and no one's telling me, outside of practice with these dilators, what the future of my sex life could look like, I don't care, so I'm thinking this is it for me. And so again, that's why I talk about it so much. When my mother was alive, she was like, you should be embarrassed of yourself because, she's a good Southern woman. But, toward the end of her life, she said, I'm really proud of you. She's like, God's going to bless you for what you're doing.
Absolutely. And thousands of other women have blessed you. I think humor is a great conversation starter for any difficult subject. In fact, I used to give a seminar at medical meetings called Using Humor to Handle Harassment and Put-Downs. So, that's a whole nother topic. But one of my worst cervical cancer stories was when I was in residency. I was doing rounds with our chairman, who was a GYN oncologist. And he was just not a good person. He was a great surgeon, but he was not a good person. And I'm not the only one who said this. But there was a young woman who was in her 20s who had had radical surgery for cervical cancer. So I think most of her vagina was removed, all of her lymph nodes, all of her organs. And we were doing rounds like a couple of days after surgery. So she was in still pretty bad shape. And he asked her if she had any questions. And she said, what kind of sex life will I ever have? And he went off on her. He just said, are you kidding me? I just saved your life and did this incredible surgery. And you're asking me about sex? And I just really wanted to hit him. Right. I did, but I was not in a position of power. And I was so intimidated, but I did go back afterwards and talk to her privately. And I said, I don't know the answer, but I just want to tell you that was a totally inappropriate way to be treated. and it's a totally appropriate question, and we will find out the answer.
And so here's this woman who may or may not have been embarrassed to ask the question, but she felt it was important enough to ask, and then she shut down in such a cruel way. In fact, in our brochures, on our website, it's one of the questions we say when you first get diagnosed. We have these kind of top 10 questions you should ask your healthcare provider. And how this will impact my sex life is one of those questions, because it is a very important question. We want women to know going into this, and not that you shouldn't have your surgery or treatment because of it, but just make sure that your doctor knows that this is important. I just got back from a conference last month in Alabama where we were talking to gynecologic oncologists. And one of the topics that, I was sitting here. So first I talked to the patients, and they were all GYN cancer patients. So one day, the next day I talked to the providers, and the patients were like, you're going to have this same talk with the providers, right? And it was all about sex and cancer. And there were doctors who said, well, I didn't realize that I was doing this, but if I have a patient that is over 65, I'm not necessarily asking them about sex and if they're having sex, what the quality of sex are. And I'm like, I don't know about you, but when I'm 65 and if I'm still here, I plan on having a lot of sex.
So I don't think most doctors ask most patients of any age about sex. I actually went with my partner just for a routine cardiology checkup. He was a certain age, and I just felt like, okay, it's time for you to have a cardiology. Kind of the same thing I did, with my daughter. I'm like, you're a man of a certain age. You just by virtue of your age, you have risk factors for cardiology and for heart disease. And I want you to just have a cardiologist so that in case you need one, he knows you. And so I went with him for the checkup, and because I had some questions of my own and questions about tests that I wanted run. And this guy, the cardiologist, was really uncomfortable asking my partner questions with me being there. And so he finally said to my guy, do you have any questions? And I said, well, just so you know, the thing you were uncomfortable to ask about is fine.
Good for you.
But I really feel that most doctors we're kind of in a don't ask, don't tell situation about any sexual.
I want to try to change that. And so I love talking to doctors. And, I let them know that, look, it's uncomfortable for you. It's uncomfortable for the patient, but someone's got to bring this up. And if the patient does not bring it up, it is your duty to bring it up. I don't even care if it's on the phone, in person, or via email. I love being able to email my doctors now.
Well, most doctors don't do email for that reason.
No, they don't.
But you could be doing email all day long, and even with the questions I get, I don't have time to answer them.
But the point is that I make to the doctors is they have to bring it up.
Right.
Because the patient, 9 times out of 10, they want it.
Right. Or they need it, or they don't know that they need it.
Exactly.
And they don't know that it's important, and they don't know how to start the conversation. However, in fairness to doctors, we've all had experiences, and I've had women tell me they were infuriated that, their psychiatrist would bring up, issues about sex. I'm like, seriously? Like, that's the number one thing they talk about. Or that, their internist would ask them about how many sexual partners they have. They're like, what business is it of yours? I've actually started telling doctors, though, that it probably isn't our business how many sexual partners you have. Instead, the way I have rephrased the question is, do you have more than one sexual partner? Because I don't need to know how many. The issue is, are you in a monogamous relationship or not? And again, many women don't know that they're not in a monogamous relationship anymore. So most gynecologists, I think, treat most patients as though they have, been exposed to everything.
But it was just really interesting, because the majority of patients that I saw were over the age of 50. We had a woman who, prior to her cancer diagnosis, she was the primary caretaker for her husband, who was a little older than her. And so they already weren't having sex. But she was just like, I still have that urge to have sex. And I was like, so you do have a toy, right? If not, we're going to go on a field trip. I love taking patients on a field trip to a sex toy shop. I just love it. It's my favorite, one of my favorite things to do. And she was like, yeah, my daughter took me to get a little lipstick bullet. And I was like, oh, you and your daughter. And then,
okay, that's a mother-daughter activity I have not done.
I haven't either, but, you know, her daughter, kudos for her for seeing that her mother wasn't dead yet, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's awesome.
And sex is a part of your life. You know, it's good. You know, and your audience, it's good for endorphins. It's good for it's good for world peace.
You know, that's what we should have these beauty pageant contestants talking about, is not just that they want world peace, but how to better get world peace.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. It's so important. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, I could talk to you all day. And of course, we've talked about like 17 other topics that we could address, but we are running out of time.
So that means you have to have me back.
I am definitely having you back. But before I let you go, I still have a couple more specific direct questions for you. So my number one specific direct question is, how do women find out about Survivor School?
So they can reach out to me at Survivor. They can go to the website, which is spelled CERVIVOR.org. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/survivor. We're on Instagram and Twitter at I am Survivor, all spelled CERVIVOR. And we have an amazing community that is welcoming. Also women who have not had cervical cancer and they just want to champion and join our cause, or men, you are welcome to. We have lots of men who reach out wanting support for their loved one.
I love this term that you used. I've never heard this before. This term of people who have co-cancers.
Yes.
I love that term.
Well,
did you make that up, or is that a thing?
I think maybe I heard it somewhere, but I feel that cancer comes in and it's a cancer. It impacts everything, every family, your friends, your work, everything about your life. And I don't think until years later, my mom told me how my cancer diagnosis impacted her, how scared she was that I was going to die. And I mean, just her trauma of watching her baby, you know, go through cancer. And so it was one of those realizations that we have to do more stuff for caregivers, but caregivers, automatically you think of a mom, a parent, or a spouse, but what about children? What about your friends? What about, you know, the whole network? And
just
so
everybody who loves you.
Exactly. And so that's where
it's about you. And a caregiver does not have to be somebody who's providing 100% care or full-time care. Exactly. They could be the person who comes in on Tuesdays and has lunch with you, you know, or, you know, they could be, you know, the person who, you know, watches, you know, TV with you on Thursday night. Right. You know, it could be a whole community. And it definitely takes a village to fight cancer. So one of the questions I ask all of my guests, and I'm going to ask you, but now you thought of another one I should add. I always ask women, and I'll give you a second to think about this. I always ask women to tell me about your most interesting, unique, memorable, or different experience that you ever had in a ladies' room, aside from this one. But I think now I'm going to start asking people to tell me their most unique story they ever had, you know, helping somebody pick a sex toy. But for you, I know that will take a whole hour. So for you, I want you to focus on telling me the most unique, interesting, different, or memorable experience you ever had in a ladies' room, aside from this interview.
I actually can tell you. So one time I was having brunch at a restaurant in Washington, D.C., and it was a pretty button-up place. And these two women were talking about how the woman got a dildo basically stuck inside of her.
Okay.
I was in the stall at the time, and I came out, and they're still talking, and I'm washing my hands, ready to leave. And somehow she's just like, and it was this little tiny thing. She's the size of a tampon. And so she said, oh, it's still up there.
Oh, no.
So I don't know how long it had been, whether it was earlier that day, the night before.
Please tell me you butted into this conversation.
And I interjected myself into the conversation. I was just like, you should go to the emergency room. They can just get it out really quickly.
Yeah. And you don't want to, I mean, people don't realize that obviously if you if you swallow something, we always say it'll pass eventually. But if you get something stuck up in your vagina, you can be a setup for terrible infections.
Right.
So even if it's tampon, that's actually another question that I think is a kind of a universal experience. I think just about every woman has had an experience where she couldn't get a tampon out once. It happens to me. And that's like a very common emergency GYN visit.
I'm traumatized from my experience and never used them again.
Oh no. Well, so many women think they could get lost.
I don't need it.
You can't get lost. It's in there. But remember, an 8.5-pound baby can come out of there. So there's lots of room and there's lots of groove. All right. So what's the most important thing that I should have asked you that I did not?
I feel like you asked me everything. Just the most important thing that I want people to do is make sure that they get their feet up in that stirrups. And you don't think that it can happen to you, but you don't know. So you have to make sure. Yeah,
my favorite line was from Patti LaBelle, who used to say, check yourself before you wreck yourself. And I think that's so awesome. And I can't tell you, I wish I had $1 for every patient who began our visit by saying, I really don't enjoy this. And then I would always say, if you enjoyed it, I'd be referring you to a psychiatrist right now. So it's not enjoyable, but it's far better than having your dental checkup, which you also need every year.
I prefer dental spas where they now give you the glasses and the earbuds because the drilling,
So that's my best use of, I'm going to give a plug to the Bose noise canceling headphones, even though I have no financial relationship with them, although they should call me because I should be their spokesperson, but I always use it in the dentist chair. Anyway, it has been such a pleasure talking to you. As always, we will definitely have you back. Good luck with everything. And on behalf of the 254,000 or 257,000 women who are living beyond cervical cancer, I want to thank you and your organization for everything that you are doing to educate women about cervical cancer screening, but also prevention, which is so, so important. So thank you. Stay well and keep in touch.
All right, I will. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
That's all we have time for today. But let's keep the conversation going on Twitter or Facebook at Dr. Donica. And please join us next week for another episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Donica. Real conversations with real women about really intimate topics.